Minimalists.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Minimalist Podcast, where we discuss what it means to live a meaningful life with less. My name is Joshua Fields Milburn.
And I am Ryan Nicodemus, and together we are the Minimalists. We got a special guest today. I am excited for this podcast, man.
We do. Welcome to episode 149. Today we're going to talk about sex and couples and traditional relationships and non-traditional relationships and a whole lot more. And because we're talking about sex, Ryan and I have never had sex, so we brought an expert on.
Well, not with each other.
What? Wait.
I mean, I've had sex before, dude. You didn't know?
Oh, man.
I totally lost my virginity.
We're here with Dr. Christopher Ryan. He's the author of Sex at Dawn, and also you got a book coming out hopefully next year or the year after. You've been penning it for many years. Civilized to Death is the next book, which I'm sure we could talk about that as well. But welcome to the show. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, dude.
So before we dive in, so the format of this show is we don't bring guests on to interview anyone. Instead, we help people answer their questions. So we've got some questions I figured we would dive into. Before we do that, though, Chris, can you tell me? I mean, I read Sex at Dawn a while ago, and it seemed relatively uncontroversial to me, but there seems to be a whole lot of controversy behind some of the ideas that you've put forth in that book. Why exactly do people feel so? Is it that people feel that their belief structures are being challenged, or why?
Yeah, I can't really comment on motivation, right? But I think there are different sources of disagreement, I think. And it's interesting because very little of the disagreement is factual. It's sort of an overall, oh, that book's bullshit. There's a lot of cherry picking. It's been debunked. I read that all the time. It's been debunked. Like, who the hell debunked it? And and how did it get bunked in the first place? But I think largely people disagree with the general notion that women are sexual beings. I think that's a big part of it. Nobody seems to have a problem with the argument that men are highly sexual beings that are attracted to variety and novelty in sexual partners. I think that's so obvious that it's kind of hard to even conceive of a disagreement with that. But where we applied that to women as well and actually said women may be even more sexual beings than men in some ways, with the multiple orgasms and the fact that, a woman could conceivably have sex with 5 men in one session, whereas a guy has sex, he has an orgasm, and it's like, what's on TV? It's kind of finished. So I think that's what people find offensive. Not everyone, by the way. A lot of people, thank God, find it liberating and stimulating. I've received dozens of emails from women saying that they had to stop and masturbate every 10 pages when they were reading. And I've never gotten a single email from a dude saying that.
Could you just assume that's happening?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think that for women, the lifting of the shame and the feeling of liberation, like, oh, I'm not sick. There's nothing wrong with me. Right. All my life I've been told that I'm not supposed to feel sexual desire the way men do. And it's natural for men, but it's shameful for me. So to read something that says, no, it's natural for you. We're Homo sapiens, men and women. We're actually very similar.
Right.
Women find that often very liberating and erotic in an interesting way.
So in a way, like you're giving them permission to be a sexual person, to be a sexual being.
Giving them permission to be a human being, a Homo sapiens. That's the argument of the book,
that is
really.
Huge.
And not just women, but just all human beings in general. There's sort of this puritanical veil that has been placed over our culture, where even talking about the topic of sex for some reason, like, I feel vulnerable just in our culture. It's a thing that's almost taboo, just even you bringing up that word, and it's not something they're supposed to talk about in public.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that we shouldn't have private lives. There are certainly things that I won't talk about in public, but I certainly shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed to talk about sex in a public forum, especially in a way that serves the greater good.
Yeah, especially with something that isn't just like a part of life, but it's necessary for life. And it's funny how there's this act that we have to keep the human race going, but yet we're so well, a lot of us are very embarrassed, or it is taboo to kind of talk about in public.
Well, don't you also think that's one of the reasons, though, is we've treated it as only an act that is to keep the human race going, and I think what you're exposing is the other side of this. Well, we can also have sex for pleasure,
Like
you know.
It doesn't just have to be functional.
Right.
Oh man, Mariah and I's bedroom game is about to change.
Right. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and dive into some of these questions.
Wait, before we dive in, can I talk about something that was in the news? I just want to get your all's take on this and how insane it is. But I saw this story about this woman who was getting, this isn't about sex, but it's kind of, I guess, along the lines, but this woman who was getting married, and she basically put out an ask to all of her guests saying, hey, I want to be a Kardashian for a day, and I want everyone to gift me $1,500 for the wedding of my dreams. Well, this and did you hear about this?
No.
So it ended up not happening. Like, basically, some people did support her that, could afford the $1,500, but essentially she didn't have enough guests RSVP and send her money. So it was like this, just this social media tyrant on how all of her friends and family, they're pieces of garbage, and how no one really cares about her, and how, it's not a lot to ask for $1,500. I would have thought that you guys would have heard about this, and it's been all over the news.
Really?
It's crazy.
No,
but I mean,
I don't understand. Why? I don't understand. So
my media blocks anything that has the word Kardashian, so nothing gets through.
How do I download that?
Mine usually
It's
does too. Well, I mean, I guess that's why I wanted to talk about it, is because we have this society where it involves a lot of reality TV. And, you could look at this with sex, too, like how there are these lives that are presented to us that it makes us feel like, oh, if we're not doing life this way, then we're not doing it right. And the same thing can be said with sex, too. Right. I think, porn is one of those things where, I don't have anything against porn, but there is, some porn where it's like most porn is staged. It is not, not normally how a couple is going to make love. Sometimes, yes, but that's not that's not the way that one should be doing it. And I guess I'm just speaking to the just the dangers of maybe reality TV, or even comparing ourselves to others. I just wanted to get your guys' take. I mean, that's absolutely insane, right? I mean, it almost sounds fake, right?
Well, it sounds to me like you're trying to distinguish fantasy from reality. I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and we pretend there's a Santa Claus. We also tell her there isn't this actual being, like this supernatural being called Santa Claus. The same way that when she watches, Daniel Tiger on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, she doesn't think that puppet is a real sentient creature. She is able to understand that it's make-believe, and in a way, maybe one of the problems is we don't understand that the Kardashians are make-believe, or a lot of pornography is make-believe as well. And there's nothing inherently wrong with watching porn. We can obviously get addicted to it, just like we can get addicted to anything else, and that's when it becomes a problem, not the device or the whatever we're consuming itself.
Yeah.
So the fantasy marriage, whether it's Kardashian or just a huge expense of money and the white gowns and all that stuff, is part of the fantasy world. And then we could say the expectations of the relationship often are part of a fantasy world as well, that we're not distinguishing from reality.
Yeah.
Which to get back to the book, that's one of the things we were talking about. This fantasy that because you love someone, you're going to be sexually attracted to them forever, and not to anyone else.
Right.
That's Santa Claus.
That's absurd. Yeah.
That's not reality. But people are comparing their actual experience to that fantasy, and they're feeling like there's something wrong with them, or wrong with their partner, or wrong with their marriage, because it doesn't live up to that ridiculous fantasy.
Right.
Well, the word you use there is expectation, right? And if it's my expectation that my partner Rebecca is never going to be attracted to another man as long as I'm with her, then I've just set myself up for failure. Or I'm being so ignorant, it's like I've got these blinders on, and man, as soon as someone removes one of those blinders, I'm going to be devastated. Yeah. Mainly because there's a poor expectation there. We were in Portland this weekend. I was at the Portland Art Museum, and there was this neon art sign on the wall that said "Expect a miracle," and I think that's okay to. I mean, not in the religious sense, but man, maybe all of this is a miracle, but maybe we're expecting the wrong miracle. And one of those miracles is I'm going to meet the, Prince Charming or the princess that I'm going to live with happily ever after. That's the wrong expectation. Maybe the expectation is I'm going to be good to someone in hopes that that I'm going to get something out of that relationship.
Yeah, I guess what I'm taking from this is we have to really be careful with the fantasies that we indulge in, and we have to be able to separate those fantasies from actual life and expectations, because just like we've been saying, when your expectations are so high and you don't have this amazing, perfect situation unfolding like you have laid it out. I mean, this girl who I'm talking about, she's not with her fiance anymore. She's not friends with her friends, and she's not friends with her friends and family anymore. I mean, it's like this huge thing, and it's not. I'm not trying to get down on this girl as much as like I want to help her, and I want to help people out there who are just indulging in these fantasies and expecting their lives to be that way. If that's the expectation we set for ourselves, we can be in for a world of hurt. So yeah, again, I guess we just have to be careful with, I guess the fantasies we indulge in and how much we try to, I don't know, live up to those fantasies, I guess.
I don't have a problem with the fantasies.
Right.
The problem seems to be pretending they're actually real.
Yeah.
And assuming they're real. And I think that's where this where this idea that's where the discontent really comes from. Is thinking that, well, this is how it is going to be, even though it's not reality.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Right.
I think we should dive into these
Let's do
questions. Our first voicemail is from Jerome in Pennsylvania.
Would you say it is intentionality or vanity if one chooses to look for specific characteristics in a partner, such as height, hair color, or other physical traits, to provide an attraction? As a person who enjoys the act of sex and the intimacy that sex provides, it is important to me that my partner's beliefs about intimacy align with my own beliefs. A relationship lacking intimacy simply won't be fulfilling for me. But to me, there is a physical component to attraction, and it would be difficult for me to be intimate with a partner I'm not attracted to physically on some level. And yet we're often told that looks don't matter, it's what's inside that counts. This makes me feel guilty for initially choosing partners based on who I have a sexual attraction to. All this seems possible if I follow this age-old advice, I may end up feeling unfulfilled. I'm old enough to know that a person's physical characteristics are not everything in a relationship, but can it be a factor in the equation and get things started? Or must we all be social pariahs for having a preference?
So Chris, I mean, I think it has to be part of the equation. I mean, unless you're asexual, which is definitely a thing, but if you want to be in an intimate relationship with someone, having an attraction, now what our attraction strategy is different for each of us. Can you talk a little bit about Jerome's question here?
Yeah, I think a mistake that people often make is conflating attraction with compatibility in a long-term relationship.
Right. I
think it's important to disentangle those and sort of think about them as separate issues, because physical attraction, as Jerome said, can sort of get it started, can draw you to someone.
The chemistry.
Yeah, but often chemistry is the result of psychological incompatibility, right? I think a lot of times what we do in relationships is we choose a partner who will sort of draw us toward issues that we have trouble with. And so that can be a source of growth because you're drawn to these issues that you're troubled by and you can work through them.
You have to confront them.
Yeah. Or you just keep banging your head against them and you have one of these like dramatic but crazy relationships that a lot of people get into, which can be sexually really fulfilling. Right? The makeup sex can be amazing. All the yelling and screaming and breaking things can get really hot if you're, that kind of person. Yeah. But I think that it's important to sort of disentangle those things because the attraction will fade over time as you become family. You live with someone for 10 years, they become a sibling.
Right.
I don't care how hot they are.
Yeah. Right. As the level of familiarity increases, the level of physical chemistry often decreases.
Right. And again, that's one of those things that people often blame themselves for, or think that's, they're told that there's something wrong with their relationship because every month Cosmo has 10 more tricks for keeping it hot in bed forever,
Yeah.
It's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
So there's a book called The Erotic Mind by a guy named Jack Morin. And I read it a long time ago, but the thing I remember is he says this very simple formula. He says, attraction plus an obstacle equals passion. And so you think about every relationship, every love story, Romeo and Juliet or whatever, there's that initial attraction, and then there's a problem. There's a reason they can't get there, right? The families won't let him, or it's a long distance thing, or she's already married, or it's two dudes and they're gay and they can't tell anyone, or whatever it is. There's always some obstacle. And so the attraction keeps building and building to try to overcome that obstacle. But once we remove the obstacle, you get together, there's no obstacle anymore, the passion diminishes. And so it's weird. It's like, what are we trying to do? You meet somebody you're really into, you want to be with them all the time, right? So you're sabotaging your own passion. It's interesting. But anyway, to get to his point, I think it's really important to separate those things. So there's nothing wrong with saying, look, I'm really attracted to short blondes with, big knees or something, but don't mistake that for compatibility.
Right.
So you might find the perfect short blonde with big knees, and that doesn't mean that you guys are good together.
Right.
It just means you like looking at pictures of her.
Right. I think that if I were to sum up what you're saying there is looks do matter in terms of attraction, but in terms of long-term compatibility, maybe something like values matter. If you have radically opposing values and beliefs, even though you might be really attracted to each other sexually,
right.
Yeah, you might have a great sexual encounter, but in terms of looking for a long-term relationship, that thing's going to fall apart. And even worse, you're probably going to stick it out longer because of the passion that you've just described there.
And you might have kids, and by the time you figure out that you're not a good match for each other, there are other innocent people involved now.
Yeah.
That's the real tragedy, I think. I mean, it's fine. Have a good time. You're attracted to a certain type of person physically. Have a good time, but don't mistake that for partnership, for compatibility, and don't try to start a family with somebody because you like the way she looks or he looks.
Yeah.
Also, you might have a type, right? Like you might have a type that you're attracted to, but that doesn't mean that's the only type of person you're attracted to as well. I mean, I think of Bex, my partner, whom you met when we were out at your house in Topanga, and she is not my type at all. But in terms of what I would traditionally date, I used to date shorter women, and Bex is tall. She's almost my height, and she has darker hair than what I would date normally. And so there are all these things where you're like, well, if I were to just pick what is my type, it would unlikely be her. However, I'm still wildly attracted to her. Not in spite of her physical look. She looks gorgeous, but realizing there can be a whole spectrum of attractiveness as well. I don't have to just have the short blonde with the big knees.
I don't know what I'm allowed to say on this podcast.
You can say whatever you want.
Say whatever you want, man.
And so what I realized though with her is the thing that keeps me attracted is the fact that we do share so many similarities outside of we're attracted physically, but everything else beyond that sort of aids the physical attraction.
Yeah. And I think that's part of maturity too. I mean, I don't know how old this dude is, but I mean, a lot of guys, 20, 22, 23, 24, they're very focused on the visual, and that's fine. Experience those things, but don't get yourself into a situation that is going to have long-term implications for other people. Then when you're in your 30s, maybe you will have matured enough to be like, hey, okay, I've been there, I've done that. Now I'm looking a little under the surface.
I've had the short blonde with the big knees.
Yeah. I've been down that road.
I think it's crazy to say that looks don't matter. You hear that kind of propagated.
It sounds virtuous.
It does
on the surface. You're
yeah,
I'm not shallow at all.
Right.
But they matter for some things and not for others.
Right. And that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is something to be said about how we've evolved up to this point too. About how these characteristics that we look for it is almost a survival mechanism in a lot of ways. So, I think for that aspect, like it's kind of, the cards are not stacked for us. I mean, they're stacked against us when it comes to looks don't matter. Like looks absolutely matter. I think it's programmed into our DNA. I love what you said about the love plus an obstacle equals passion. Attraction. Yeah. Attraction plus obstacle.
Yeah.
It's like almost kind of reiterates or affirms that whole thing of, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And looking at that specifically with sex, I mean, it totally makes sense. So when you get into a relationship where maybe you are attracted to the person, drop dead gorgeous, 10 years pass, and you get to this point where, yes, you're comfortable, maybe you're not as, sexually attracted because of that familiarity thing that we were talking about. Maybe, to get over that hump, it's about putting in some type of obstacle or putting in some type of excitement. I haven't got to that point with Mariah yet, but it's interesting because if that's the equation for passion, then I feel like there are ways that people who've been in relationships for 20 years, they can find a way to maybe make an obstacle or make something to create more passion in the relationship.
Vacation separately.
Yeah. Interesting.
Miss each other.
That is an interesting concept.
Well, it's like intermittent fasting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's the same sort of thing. It's like you want to appreciate your food more, be hungry.
Yeah.
Right. But if you're just sitting in the kitchen all day eating every time you have a slight pang of hunger, well, you're never going to be hungry, and then you're not going to really pay attention to your food either.
Yeah, that fourth piece of chocolate cake is not nearly as satisfying as the meal that you've had, even a really healthy meal that you've had after an 18 or 20 hour fast. Right. Bex and I, we spend a week on and a week off just based on some geographical issues that we have. So our daughter, her biological father lives in Montana still, and so she has to basically shuttle back and forth, and so we spend a week apart every other week. And I could tell you that obstacle certainly leads to a whole lot more chemistry when we are together because of that time apart. We're vacationing apart every other week basically, and man, it's difficult. It really is difficult. And there are times where I'm just like, I want to say fuck this. Like this is way too hard to deal with. I wish you were here right now. But of course, if you were here 24 hours a day, then it's not that I would take it for granted, but it would be granted.
Yeah. So when it comes to looks and relationships, I think that we should be clear on what our preferences are, and we should honor those preferences. But putting those as number one, that is not going to create a great relationship. So when I started looking for a partner, when I started doing online dating, that's how I met Mariah. I had this thing where I was like, yes, I want to be attracted to someone. I do want there to be some sexual attraction, but I'm not going to not go on a date with a girl just based upon her looks, because it is very possible to meet someone that maybe isn't your 10 out of 10 with looks, but personality is 10 out of 10, and sometimes it does make a difference. Sure. Yeah. So
I heard you and Duncan talking about this on your podcast. So Chris has a podcast called Tangentially Speaking, and I think he said something about he met a 70-year-old woman who was one of the sexiest women he's ever met.
Yeah, that's awesome. And
part of that, it had very little to do with her looks. It had to do with her there was a particular confidence and almost like this aura around her.
He said she was really good in bed, too.
Well, that helps.
That is awesome. That's awesome.
All right. Well,
one line that came to me. Someone said, I think it was Oscar Wilde. Maybe he said, "Men learn to love women they're attracted to, and women learn to be attracted to men they love."
Oh, wow!
So there's also a gender difference in this question. I think it's probably true that women are less tied to the visual than men are. Certainly young men.
And we're creating a monolith here. It's obviously different.
There are plenty of exceptions.
Yeah, it's a spectrum for everyone.
Why do you think that is? Why is it different for men and women that way? I know you do write a little bit about in Sex at Dawn about how it used to be where a woman had to rely on a man for for shelter, for food. I mean, there were.
Well, that's the narrative we argue against, actually, right? That's
I'm
the
sorry,
standard narrative that women relied on men for shelter and food and all that in prehistoric times. Turns out there's very little evidence for that. Certainly after agriculture, that became the norm. And so, the idea that women are attracted to men for their wealth, we argue, is an artifact of post-agricultural context, that's not biological. Because in the prehistoric, pre-agricultural times, where resources were shared, egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, women didn't need to rely on men to bring them meat or shelter or protection or these things. So that's sort of one of the schisms between what we argue in Sex at Dawn and the mainstream view.
And what actually, yeah. So I mean, I guess going back to the question, is there, I guess it's just like I don't know, I mean, it comes down to biology. I don't know why women would care less about looks than men would. Is there any reason behind that?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different theories for that. I think one of them could be sperm competition, which is another thing we talked about in Sex at Dawn, where if a woman's having sex with 3 or 4 different men within the same menstrual cycle, their sperm will fight it out within her, and women have biological mechanisms that choose the sperm that's most compatible with her.
Oh, wow.
And so often the man who would be the best match for her biologically is not necessarily the best looking guy. It's the visuals are not the main component or the main indication of biological compatibility, at least in terms of the compatibility of immune system. So we talk about research done by Klaus Wedekind in Switzerland. He was the first to do this research where he was trying to understand why women's sense of smell is so much more acute than men's. And I don't remember this anecdote. I think this applies to him, where he was listening to some of his students talking, and the women were saying something about, like, yeah, this guy's cute, but he doesn't smell right. And so, like, and he thought, man, I've never heard a man say that. I've never heard a man say, man, she's hot, but the smell's not quite right, you know? Yeah. So that's what spurred him to think about this stuff. And his hypothesis was that it's about immune system compatibility. So to oversimplify it, let's say there are 5 components of, it's called major histocompatibility index, I think. There are 5 components of immune response that correspond to 5 different types or classes of pathogens, right? And so he said, okay, I'm going to find a bunch of women who are low. They're fine on 4, but they're low on 1. So they're low on type 1, they're low on type 2, low on type 3, and so on. And then I'll find men who have the same, variation. So he's fine on 4, but he's low on type 1 or low on. So his hypothesis was that a woman who's low on type 1 will not be attracted to a man who's low on type 1 because their kids would have this vulnerability.
Right.
She's going to want to be with someone who's high on type 1 to compensate for her vulnerability there. So what he did was he had these guys wear T-shirts for 3 days and nights, no deodorant, no shower, no soap.
Yeah.
And then they put the T-shirts in a Ziploc bag. And then the women would smell the T-shirts and mark how attractive they thought the men were just based on the smell of their T-shirt, right? Okay. And he found that about 80% of the women chose correctly. They chose men who were high in what they were low in, right? But about 20% of the women seemed to be choosing randomly. So he reran the study, same thing. 20%, what is it?
Birth control.
Birth control pills, right.
Oh, wow.
Those women were on birth control. So it short circuits that system for picking up whether or not the guy's going to be a good match. Now, none of this is happening consciously, right? So he might be Brad fucking Pitt, but he smells wrong,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas, all 3 of us, looking at Salma Hayek is like, fine, I don't care what she smells like.
Right.
Fine, I'm in there. So there's a biological difference between the way men and women assess a potential partner.
That's so
Well,
interesting.
I think the answer for Jerome is that just get some sweaty shirts, start mailing them out to women, and see what happens, man. No, Jerome, I'd love to send you a copy of our book, Minimalism, Live a Meaningful Life. In there, since we talked about values, getting clear on what your values are is pretty important. I know when I was going partner hopping for the longest time, part of that was I just wasn't clear on what type of person I wanted to be.
Right.
And I think if you don't know the type of person you want to be, it's hard to find the person that matches with your ideal self.
Yeah.
Or the person you are.
Yeah.
You know, which is hopefully who you want to be.
Right. hopefully you're in line. You know, your current actions are in line with what your future self wants to be. If not, then getting clear on what those values are will at least give you a path on which you can travel. So, Sean, if you could reach out to him, send him a copy of Minimalism, Live a Meaningful Life, either the audiobook or the book or the ebook. It looks like our next question is from Sarah. I don't know where she's from, but she says she's asking for a friend.
I have about 20 pairs of very nice lingerie and other sexual items. I've been single for 7 years. I have already minimalized my collection twice, and I feel like I have the basics stored down to one box. What to do with the just-for-win relationship items when you're not in a relationship? I get zero value from these items alone. The next relationship could always be right around the corner. I hope.
So, Josh, what do you do with all your old lingerie?
I'm wearing some of it right now. It's funny. Like, so the reason that Sarah's asking this question is, we often talk about getting rid of unused items. If I'm not finding value in something, then maybe someone else can. But there are some things that are harder to donate than other things, like sex toys or lingerie. There's one thing that if you come to
Used sex toy shop, patent pending.
you're gonna need a better name than that.
Make it an acronym.
Dildos are us.
Yeah, dildos are us.
If you come over to our house, we have an entire bin of sex toys. Bex and I do.
Play it again, sex toys.
No.
Play it again, Sam. There you go.
All right, sorry. I'll get off.
And so, like, I don't think that the fact that Sarah has 20 pairs of lingerie is in and of itself a problem, if that's the only thing. Mm-hmm. The average American house has 300,000 items in it. If you have 20 pieces of lingerie and you got rid of all 20 of them, it doesn't really put a dent in everything else. What 20 pieces of lingerie or a whole bunch of sex toys that aren't curated intentionally, it's symptomatic of this like broader sort of deficit that you're experiencing. Like, I feel my life is incomplete. My sex life is incomplete, so I'm going to bring something in that is going to make it more complete. That's not how I look at sex toys or lingerie or whatever else we do in the bedroom. The sex toys that I have augment the experience of sex, as opposed to well, it's not a very good sex life. Well, the best sex toys in the world aren't going to make a terrible sex life outstanding overnight.
Right.
They enhance, they amplify the experience of what's going on in the bedroom. So, I mean, the fact that Sarah has 20 different pairs of lingerie laying around, she's saying they're just for win items. We like to delineate just in case, just for win, just in case of these things that you're giving yourself permission to hold on to, even though you're never actually going to use them again. Yeah. If that's the case, if you're actually never going to use them, then please get rid of them. They're getting in the way. They're obviously, and right now they're psychological clutter for her. Yeah. If you feel like you're never going to use them, you're unlikely to use them in the future, then by all means get rid of them. If you know you're going to use them at some point, then hold on to them for whatever period you feel comfortable for.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about I don't know, man. Like if Mariah had a bunch of lingerie before I met her, I mean, I would totally be accepting of that, and appreciate her dressing sexy for me. But, and this is just my own personal preference, us going out and buying a lingerie outfit for Mariah, that's a much more a much more fun sexual experience.
Oh, okay, because she's trying it on for you.
Yeah, and like I know that I'm the only man that has seen. I mean, not that I'm like super jealous and protective, but I mean there is something about breaking in that outfit, and it was her and I that broke it in, not like this. Oh, I wonder how many other dudes she's worn this piece of lingerie for. Again, that would not deter me from dating Mariah at all. But there is a different experience I think that happens from having some used lingerie that you've had your entire life, and then bringing in something new that with a new partner.
I think the psychological part there's some sort of psychological downside. And maybe you can speak to this because, Chris, you have a very healthy perspective on things like this. But I remember there was a girl I was dating who wanted me to use this cock ring she had.
I remember this story.
And I'm like, okay.
She's like, yeah.
I'm like, that's
here,
cool.
put this on.
I'm like, all right, no problem. And I'm like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. How many guys have used this? And I'm like, no, I'm good, but I'm good with using one. I just don't want to use, even though I'm sure she washed it, took care of it, and all these other things. Like, there was this psychological barrier there. Can you talk about some of those psychological barriers, maybe?
No.
What's wrong with me?
Doc, what's wrong with Josh? What's wrong with us?
Was it the right size?
Extra medium.
Extra medium.
Extra average.
XM.
It was, aggressively average.
Yeah. No, you know more about sex toys than I do. Apparently, I had no idea you were such an expert. That's great.
I don't know that I'm much of an expert. I just know that Bex and I have experimented a lot. And it's not in a way it's like I want to keep our relationship fresh, but it's just like, but maybe that's part of it.
You just like tools?
Yeah.
Let's see what we got.
Let's see if we guys got like a toolbox. It's like a sex toolbox.
I think what I like, and I probably owe you $60 after this therapy session here, but
$60. When's the last time
he lives in Los Angeles, dude?
Yeah.
$250 an hour in LA. Man.
I'm from Dayton, Ohio, man.
Oh yeah.
$60 a week's pay in Dayton.
Yeah. Plus a tip.
Well, I think it's part of it is the newness, like experiencing something new with someone, like you talked about with going to buy lingerie with Mariah as opposed to the thing that she's used for many years with multiple partners.
Which by the way, it's not a deal breaker either way, but there is a preference that I have for sure.
Well, you're pointing out that it's not about the thing; it's about the experience.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's it. And if something happened to all the sex toys we have at home, I'm not going to feel any particular way about it other than inconvenience by having to buy new ones. But even then, it would be like, bringing these things in intentionally, because it isn't about the thing. Yeah. I don't actually get the value from the thing. It's what I'm able to do with the thing.
It's funny. It's talking about the thing, the sex toys. Earlier, you said that sex toys aren't going to make your sex life better. And I do agree with you in the sense that if I had a really shitty sex life, me going out and buying sex toys isn't going to all of a sudden make my sex life awesome.
Right.
But I do think that the sex toys, it can, yes, enhance the experience that's happening already. But what I have found is that sex toys help with helping people get more comfortable with themselves, helping people to be okay with exploring their bodies in different ways. Where having specific sex toys will kind of force you into experimenting with your body in different ways, depending on which sex toy you get. Where otherwise, without that tool, it's not. I feel like it's not as easy to experiment with yourself. Does that make sense or not?
I think there's a lot of shame.
You're talking about butt plugs. Yeah.
I am totally talking about butt plugs and anal beads.
Well, I mean,
this is taking a turn I wasn't expecting.
Welcome to the Minimalist Podcast.
Where we talk about butt plugs.
This is a safe space here.
Yeah.
No, I think a lot of it has to do with shame. And even saying the word butt plug, we say it jokingly because there's almost like this puritanical that we should never get pleasure from something like that.
Right.
Especially as a man, like
Right.
sticking anything in my butt, that's gay, and I can't be gay. Even if a woman does it, it's gay. And it's like, well,
That's
okay.
crazy,
Like
yeah.
it's this cultural
stigma or like taboo, like yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're right. And so what do we do to get around that? I mean, it has to do with getting comfortable with that discomfort.
Yeah.
And I think the toys help augment that in a way that that maybe you wouldn't otherwise. And when I say toys, it could also be the lingerie that she's holding on to.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't matter how strong or fast I am. I mean, I'm not as fast as a J900 vibrator. I don't even know if that's a real
Hitachi magic wand.
the Hitachi magic wand.
Have one of those.
Right.
All right. Well, Sarah, I'd love to send you a copy of Sex at Dawn. Sean, if you could reach out to Sarah and send her a copy of that, I would appreciate it. I don't know if it'll tell you what to do with your lingerie, but it might tell you why you've evolved to want to wear lingerie if you read between the lines. Anyway, we'd love to hear what y'all have to say. So if you have a comment or tip about sex or sex toys, apparently, including advice for any of our callers today, leave us a voicemail, 406-219-7839. You can also email a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com. We'll air our favorite comments and tips on a future episode, and stay tuned to the end of this episode for this week's listener comments and tips. Ryan, what time is it?
It's time for our lightning round where we answer questions from social media.
We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram @The Minimalists. Now, Chris, this is what we do on a lightning round. We try to give someone a pithy, shareable, less than 140 character response. You don't have to worry about that, though.
Okay.
What we do is we just really maunder on quite a bit, and eventually we tie it up with a little bow that is sometimes tweetable.
Right.
Usually not, though. But we also keep all those tweetable sayings in one place. It's minimalmaxims.com. Ryan, what's our first question?
Our first lightning round question is from Hanno. Hanno writes, is building an emotional base necessary for a healthy sexual life?
Chris?
Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Does she mean with, or he mean with the partner, or in oneself?
I think what they're saying is to have, that's a great point, actually. But I think what they're asking is, in order to have a healthy sex life, or you could look at it as a good sex life, do you have to build this emotional foundation first in order to have good sex? That's the way I take the question.
Relationship.
Yeah.
I think it depends what you mean by good sex. Maybe you mean fulfilling sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That could also...
Well, see, I took it... I misunderstood the question because I took it to mean within oneself. Like getting back to your point earlier, like who you want to be, and I said, well, who you are.
Right.
I often think that... one of the things I say to people who write to me asking for advice is figure out what are your non-negotiables and then don't negotiate. Right? Yeah. So, for example, I never wanted to have kids.
Yeah.
I knew it when I was young. It's like, no, I'm not going down that road. I don't need the hassle, don't need the mortgage, don't need all that. I want to be free to fuck off and quit this job and, do whatever. I knew that really young, and if I met a woman who wanted to have kids, I don't care how hot she was, how wonderful she was, I didn't want to go down that road because I knew we would eventually have to split, or she'd end up, and this actually happened, where I was with a woman who was like, "That's okay, I don't need to have kids." And it's like, oh, wait a minute. No, that's going to end badly.
Well, because what happens is you drag them down a path, and they'll...
Your path, yeah.
They'll become resentful, or eventually she'll get you to cave, and then you're resentful.
Oops, I'm pregnant.
Someone's giving up something in that situation.
Something big.
Yeah, something big.
Right. These things that are mutually exclusive in this case. However, the thing I would posit is sometimes those non-negotiables change over time as well.
True.
I was the same exact way. Never wanted kids, and that was part of my non-negotiables. And then I met Bex, and like I realized when I met her, she had a 1-year-old, and she had just got out of this marriage. And I realized, like, okay, this is a non-negotiable for me. Let me assess this and do so in a way that I can determine whether or not this is a path that I want to go down. Does this negotiable change over time? And so for my 28-year-old self, it's one of the biggest reasons my marriage ended is because I didn't want to have kids. But now my 37-year-old self, I've I've decided I also have to fully embrace it too. You can't be, sort of 1 foot in the water here. I have to. It's either all in or not in at all.
Right.
And so also understanding that as your life changes, some of those negotiables can change, and it's probably worth looking at your non-negotiables every year and saying, okay, is this still something that I believe in?
I like that.
Or does it, or is there a good reason for it to change?
Yeah.
I think the thing that I would say to Hannah was an emotional base is important for all relationships, not just intimate relationships. Like if you want good interpersonal relationships and also a good relationship with yourself, so going back to what you had to say, then yes, you have to have this strong emotional foundation, because you can have a very rational person, but if they're constantly lashing out in rage or something, then they don't have that strong emotional base. Then they're not able to behave rationally. My pithy answer, Ryan, is instability is the birthplace of chaos, and I think that sometimes we what happens is we go with the flow for a while, and we end up with the partner who maybe does or doesn't want to have kids, or we go with the flow a little bit more and we've bought this oversized suburban house with a 30-year mortgage. We go with the flow a little bit more, and all of a sudden I've got 3 cars because I have to fill up my 3-car garage. You go with the flow, and it's ostensibly stable, but you didn't do any of these things intentionally. It was just one seemingly small digression after another, until you're buried in instability. Yeah. And all of a sudden, this thing that seemed stable just because it was some template you've been sold, this meme of the American dream or whatever, actually yields chaos if you didn't do it intentionally. Now, if you want the 3-car garage house in the suburbs, and you want the 4 kids and the 2 dogs and the 1 cat, and you do that intentionally, great. I say you shouldn't deprive yourself of that, but don't think because that's one person's template it's necessarily your template.
Yeah. Well, my pithy answer is having a healthy sex life is going to be different for everyone. In my experience, great sex happens when it's consensual and all parties' preferences are respected and supported. That's really my way of saying, do you need to have an emotional connection with someone in order to have like good sex? I think that's different for everyone. Some people, I know girls who are very much comfortable with their bodies and they like to go out and hook up. So like they will go out, find a guy, whether they have emotional ties or not, they feel very sexual and they want to have that experience, and that's all they want to have, and then they never talk to that person again. Like I support people's preferences. Go ahead.
That sounds like they have a very strong emotional foundation. Someone
with themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what I was getting at is I think you're interpreting this question correctly. I think that I'm looking at it wrong, because yes, like I think ultimately in order to have great sex, like you have to be emotionally stable yourself first. Even before, I think in any relationship, before you really dive deep and cultivate a great relationship, it's the whole thing with putting the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can help others. I think the same can be applied with sex. Like you're getting at, like that specific person that I'm talking about, she's very comfortable with herself. She's very emotionally stable, and she likes to go out and have sex, and that's what she does, and that's totally fine. But yeah, it definitely starts with this up. I do. I'll show you after.
Dan Savage, I'm sure you're familiar with Dan. He has this term GGG, good, giving, and game. Yeah. And I think that's what your answer sort of. I just wrote that right next to your answer here, Ryan. You have to be, you want to be good at sex, whatever good is for you and your partner or partners. Giving, meaning you're not just taking from the situation, which is quite honestly what a lot of men do. Is I'm just going to try to take from this, and as soon as I achieve orgasm, then of course the act is done. Well, because in many cases it is done. Yeah. And then game is willing to do anything within reason, right? So if your partner wants you to partake in something, even if it's something that you're uncomfortable with, being willing to do that as long as it is within reason. You're going to have your non-negotiables, obviously, as well.
Yeah. Totally agree. All right, our next question is from Michael. How should one respond when people are surprised when a couple chooses a traditional route, like waiting until after marriage to live together and have sex? people seem really confused that my fiance and I haven't moved in together yet.
Oh man, I can't wait to hear what Chris has to say. So I have a pithy answer for you, and then I want to unpack it a little bit. My pithy answer is no response is often the most appropriate response. I mean, if you're having people just criticize you that don't have the complete picture, you're not required to respond. And I think quite often we forget that you aren't you don't owe anybody a formal response because they're not in a line with what your decision is.
No, I totally agree. I was just saying my pithy answer is along the same lines. People who challenge your values and beliefs are not entitled to a response. So yeah, to your point, like, yeah, if someone is especially criticizing your values and beliefs, we naturally want to defend ourselves. We naturally want to say, well, I'm doing it this way because of these reasons, because we want to be okay with our decisions. But just because we feel that way doesn't mean we have to elicit that to other people.
I think the data shows that, and not even the data, but just the empirical experience of everyday people, it's not the best idea to wait till after marriage to move in with someone and have sex with them. I'm not saying that you can't have one of our closest friends, Adam, who waited till marriage and has been married for many years, has 4 kids together, and because he has a particular set of religious beliefs that preclude him from having sex before marriage. Having sex before marriage. Mm-hmm. I think though that you don't really understand what you're necessarily getting into. Chris?
It's very cultural. Your friend Adam, he's coming from a cultural context where those things make sense, and for him to behave outside of them would be disruptive and unfamiliar and probably create problems with his family and his community. Some of the most stable marriages in the world are arranged marriages.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Where they're certainly not having sex. They don't even know each other necessarily before they get married. Mm-hmm. So, there are cultural considerations that need to be taken into account. But your point is well taken. Sexual compatibility is something you don't know really until you experience it. I always tell people this from a Western, secular background. If you don't have those religious considerations, I think a really good thing to do before you make a serious commitment is travel together. Because travel brings up a lot of the tensions because there are so many variables, exactly. So many surprises. And so you can see how people deal with stress. You can see how good they are at communicating. You can see how you two resolve, because you're going to have issues. She wants to go see the pyramids. You want to go down the Nile. We got to work this out. How does that happen? So I think a good 3 month, I'm not talking about a week. I'm talking about several months on the road. Yeah. At the end of that, you'll know.
Yeah. Yeah. So if whatever your cultural context precludes you from having sex before getting married or not living together before getting married, this is maybe a bit of a way to hack the system there. Yeah. All right. Well,
it doesn't have to be sex, but it has to be some challenging, intimate experience, I think, can be really helpful. Yeah.
And by the way, sex should get better over time is at least my experience, if you're comfortable with each other. Because yes, the chemistry that we talked about earlier, it wanes significantly after the first 90 days, first year. Mm-hmm. That chemistry is going to wane, but what isn't going to wane is your willingness to experiment or try new things and be open with each other. And I think the compatibility can grow after the first year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say sex should or should not be any way, but yeah, ideally, I agree, man. Finding a partner, being able to, explore as time goes on and make sex a much better experience, a much more enjoyable experience. Man, the not living with each other before getting married or not having sex before marriage, there's nothing wrong with having those values, right? What it comes down to for Michael here is, why is Michael doing this? Are they doing this because they are, really devout Christians and this is what they believe in, and they are really making their actions, their short-term actions, align with their long-term values and beliefs? Or is it something that they're doing just for their parents, or that they're doing just for for their friends? So I think that is where that's where the decision can be wrong, is when you're doing it for other reasons than for you and your partners. So
who are you doing this for? And if you're doing it for you, then that makes sense. If you're doing it to appease someone else, here's the thing. We just did an episode on parents. Ryan had a funeral for his relationship with his father back on episode 145. I think part of that was like realizing that you weren't ever going to be able to appease his set of beliefs.
So long story short, he is a very devout Jehovah's Witness. My partner and I live together. We, even though I think at this point, like there's a certain point where if you live with someone long enough, like you have to have a legitimate divorce if you move out. Like there isn't common law. Yeah. But I mean, and it's different every state into the country. But anyway, because Mariah and I are not married, my father essentially just called me and he's like, "Hey man, I just want to let you know that if you have an emergency, feel free to reach out to me. But other than that, I'm not even going to have a meal with you because of your misconduct." I mean, just kind of going down that line. So I had one or two choices, man. I could either cave in and get married, or I can live up to what I feel like is a meaningful life. And ultimately, I don't want to get married again. I think the piece of paper is for me and for Mariah. It's a little silly. It's a little antiquated. I really love waking up every morning and not feeling like, oh, I have to be next to this person. There's a piece of paper that says I have to be here. I like waking up every morning and like choosing to dive into that relationship every single day. I mean, I wake up with Mariah every morning and I seriously am like, oh wow, I am so happy to wake up to you every single morning. It is so awesome to wake up next to you every morning. And I tell her that most mornings. If we were married, I don't know if that feeling would change. I'm sure it wouldn't. But there is a factor there when you are forced into doing something. So this is me rambling and saying why Mariah and I aren't going to get married personally. We have nothing against marriage. We just aren't religious, and we aren't going to get married ourselves. But my point is that I have taken the judgment that my dad has given me, and I have essentially been able to look at that and say, okay, that's your problem. That's not my problem. And I'm going to go ahead and like let you live your life, and I'm going to live my life. And I would say the same thing for Michael. I mean, if there's people who aren't supporting you with the values that you and your partner have instilled and that you're acting on, I mean, you might want to question whether or not you want to, how much you want those types of people to be involved with your life and with your relationships.
Yeah. Well, P.S. Ryan, we have one more question.
Okay.
Yvetti asks, high libido versus low libido. How can couples work on finding what makes them both happy? And if y'all want to hear our answer to that question, you can listen to this week's postscript episode over at the Minimalists private podcast. It's available exclusively to our Patreon supporters. So if you want to support our show, keep it 100% advertisement free, because advertisements suck, then head on over to theminimalists.com/support. In addition to our weekly postscript episodes, the Minimalist private podcast feed includes our monthly Ask the Minimalist Anything episodes, unreleased recordings of our live events, and the entire back catalog of past private episodes. You can find all the details and all the good stuff over at theminimalists.com/support. And here is a snippet from this week's postscript episode.
I agree with you that it's important to look for somebody who's got, libido in the general range. But the problem is that libido changes over life so much.
Oh, yes, it does. That's true.
A woman gets pregnant, that can have effects. Menopause has effects. Stress, any sort of work stress, a death of a parent, anything can affect libido. It's very malleable in that sense. So even if you are lucky enough to find somebody in alignment with you, you're going to experience these sort of disconnects over time if you stay together.
All right, now it's time for our added value portion of the show. This is where we each talk about something that has added value to our lives recently. I wrote this down. I knew we'd be talking a little bit about sex toys today, but there's a website called ojoysextoy.com.
Okay.
And it's like little comic strips about sex toys. And it's like this husband and wife couple who, in a very upfront way, just talk about their experience with different sex toys. And like, I like this one, but my wife didn't like it. Or I kind of like this, my husband didn't. Or this is pretty good, but I don't think it's worth the money. Or wow, this thing is amazing if you're like this, but if you're not like this, then I would try this. And so, but they do it with a comic strip, and they put out new.
So it's like a review on sex toys, essentially.
Yes, yeah, but via like Peanuts or something, type comics. So yeah, you can check that. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Ryan, what's been adding value to your life recently?
I just came across the podcast called Philosophy Bites. Dude, it's so good. It's like these little 20-minute excerpts of like, it's not even excerpt, it's a 20-minute podcast of different topics on philosophy. Mariah and I, we were like sitting at the airport and we had some time to kill. I'm like, let's, look up a new podcast that we haven't listened to. And we came across this one, and it was a 20-minute podcast on why Buddhism is the right religion. Now, it didn't convince me that Buddhism is the right religion, but it was this very interesting take on Buddhism and its philosophy, and I certainly was able to take away a couple little nuggets to apply to my own life from a 20-minute podcast.
Yeah.
And all of their podcasts that's why it's Philosophy Bites. It's like these little bites of philosophy. Totally worth it, and like, yeah, really short and easy to listen to. Cool. What about you, man? What's going on here? Like, what podcasts are you really loving right now? Is there anything that stands out?
I've listened to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History. Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah. Really good. Listened to all of that when I was on the road recently in Colorado. Very recent, I just listened to Chuck Palahniuk with Joe Rogan.
Yeah, that was really
Did
good.
you hear that one?
Yeah,
it was fantastic.
Yeah, and he told a great story about, he told, they were like exchanging stories. It was almost like this. They were dueling stories between the two of them.
And they were getting to know each other. Yes. I like that when Joe doesn't know the guy or the person, and you can see, like, it was really awkward at the beginning.
Yeah, because he had this wrong
And then
fact.
they had a rhythm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, here's what I know about you. And Chuck's like, that's not me.
You're right. And you can tell Rogan was, like, embarrassed. Like, well, I don't know where to go from here. But, like, the stories, Chuck Palahniuk was built for writing, and the way in a weird way though, he's an extroverted writer, which is uncommon. But like the way he develops stories is he goes out and tells and talks to people about stories, and so he's actually good at the auditory storytelling.
And he listens, he pulls anecdotes from other people and he writes them down and then uses them.
He like captures them. He has he treats his notebook as sort of the way to capture those little nuggets of thought and philosophy, and then shapes it into a story. The story he told about who's the gal who wrote Wild?
Cheryl Strayed.
Yeah,
that was intense.
Oh my god, I won't even ruin it here because I wouldn't do it justice.
Yeah,
but it was such an intense story.
I gotta look it up now.
I think it's episode 1155.
Podcast Sean, put it in the show notes so I can reference it later.
I might be wrong with that, but it's somewhere right around there.
It's just in the last week or two.
Yeah, it's really good. So
mid-August.
We'll throw a link to that in the show notes as well. But you've been traveling around quite a bit. You've got the I think you have a name for your little RV.
Scarlett Johansson. It's a red van.
Oh, that is so good.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're doing with your podcast because you are pursuing your curiosity in a way that most people are discouraged to do once they've turned 18 and they've
specialized.
Yeah, you're like you have to you've turned 18 and here's 6 figures worth of debt. You have to do this one thing for the rest of your life. I was with an Uber.
Have a good life.
I was with an Uber driver in Portland recently, and she was going to school to be an insurance actuary. And I'm
exciting.
Like, I'm like, that's cool. Like, if that's what you want to do. She's like, well, it's a job. I'm like, well, you're getting ready to go through 4 more years of school for it's a job.
Yeah.
Like, is this what you're curious about? Well, no, but that's how you make money through math. And I'm like, that's not the only way to make money through math. There are mathematicians who make money. And the thing that I really appreciate about what you do with your podcast is you literally just you drive a van around North America and talk to people who sometimes you don't even know their last name.
Yeah.
There was a musician you had on recently. You're like, I'm with Steve. Steve, what's your last name? You're like, he's like, if I was a fucking professional, I'd have a piece of paper printed out in front of me. And I'm like, damn it, why do I print out pieces of paper and have them in front of me? I want to be more like Chris.
Well, see, I was thinking I want to be more like you guys. You got all your notes written out here, and I've been doing. I'm in like episode 350 or something, and I'm still like, I don't have an outro written down or an intro. I'm just winging it. It's sloppy, but
I will say though,
that's my vibe.
Being on your podcast was one of my favorite podcasts because it was we were just chilling in your backyard, and it was like really laid back. And the only reason I like this format with having pieces of paper because I will ramble and get off topic if I don't have some kind of structure. I do need structure in my life.
Yeah.
Well, when we were on your podcast a couple years ago, I left there and it was almost a little throwaway line, but it struck me. You know how sometimes there's just these little throwaway bits that stick with you. Ryan was telling some joke about masturbating, and he's like, and then afterward, I'm just like, oh my God, what have I done? And all Chris said was, hey man, I think you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, he said maybe, he's like, do I need to give you points on masturbation?
but like that's the thing. I think it was Kafka who said life's most profound truths cannot be discussed only via jokes. And
Wow.
part of that was like, what you were saying is you were brought up to feel shame for masturbating.
Right.
And what you were saying is, well, if you're feeling shame, you're doing it wrong. Like, not doing the act of masturbate, but like psychologically, you can let go of that shame. It is not a prerequisite for enjoying yourself. The shame isn't. So like, but that's the thing about your podcast. You do these Toma and Roma episodes, talking out my ass and ranting out my ass. Yeah, and
So good.
you'll do that, and it's almost. You said it's a mess, but it's like the most beautiful mess.
No,
so
thank you.
So
Really
thank you
is.
for what you put out into the world. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And speaking about what we're putting out in the world, real quick, we have the last segment here called Right Here, Right Now, where we talk about what's going on in the lives of the minimalists. Ryan, I couldn't make it to our gay dodgeball finals.
I find it funny
last
how this
week.
was your idea, and you've missed more games than anyone on the team, Josh. Do you want to explain yourself?
I have a 5-year-old daughter.
Oh, whatever,
and
dude.
a babysitter was
Dude,
out
I'll
of
fill
town.
in for you. I love dodgeball.
Oh man, so
It's like the only sport I've ever been any good at.
I should have got a hold of you.
we joined this gay dodgeball league. We didn't know it was. I mean, it was totally fine, but like we show up there and like we're the only 6 straight people there.
There were more straight people on our team, I think, than any other team. Because one of the dudes were like, they were talking to their friend, and he was like, "Look at this." He's like, "We are outnumbered. This is not right."
How did we do last week?
Dude, I don't want to talk about it. I'm surprisingly horrible at dodgeball. I don't know. I think because I'm so wide, maybe. I don't know, dude. I am an easy target. I look like I should be good at dodgeball, so I think people, they target me. But secretly, I'm just really bad, so I get out really quickly.
It was a whole lot of fun.
If we didn't finish last, we finished second to last in the tournament.
Well, that's
Might have been different if you were there, Millie.
it. Probably would have been. We just did a podcast. Our friend Justin, who read all of our audiobooks, Justin Malik, has a great podcast called Optimal Living Daily. And congratulations to him. He just hit his 1,000th episode.
It's incredible.
He puts out a podcast actually he puts out several, because he has several other podcasts. He just reads other people's work. So he'll take like essays that he really finds profound. And he asked us to do episode 1001 and 1008 for him. I read a short story by Zadie Smith, which seemed totally inappropriate, and he still is going to publish it somehow. But
What's the story about? What's it called?
well, it's back to the life's most profound problems can be discussed only with jokes or with fiction. And so you're able to talk about the sort of current political climate in a way that you can't talk about head on without offending everyone. But sometimes if you write it in this sort of fictive narrative, all of a sudden you're able to discuss these things that are somehow less offensive. Yes. It's like Ta-Nehisi Coates' fiction is less offensive than his non-fiction to certain people, and And it's strange to me because they cover the same topics and they essentially say the same things. In fact, you can be more experimental and more over the top with fiction sometimes because it is via the lens or the lattice work of storytelling.
Yeah,
it's like South Park gets away with a lot of stuff you could never get away if it wasn't a cartoon.
Right,
you know?
right. Yeah,
the format diffuses it somehow.
Yeah, not only is it fictional, but it's got this really cheesy format that you can't take serious even if you tried.
Right,
yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah, so I read, what did you read?
I read The Stonecutter. I just picked that story because it was short, it was simple, and I probably heard that story and I was like, do you know about this story, The Stonecutter?
No.
Oh man, I'm gonna ruin it for everyone here. It's the story is about a stonecutter who hates their job, and then they look up at the sun and they're like, man, the sun. Now I wish I could be the sun. That is powerful. So then they become the sun, and then the clouds block the sun. They wish they could become the clouds, so forth and so. And so eventually they become this mountain, and they're like, man, like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm here. I did it. I'm a mountain. And then like they feel themselves withering away, and then they look down and they see a stonecutter chipping away at the mountain. So the whole idea of this story is just it's really it really helps me with perspective, and that grass is always greener on the other side feeling that I have. I mean, I'm so glad I heard that story in the 4th grade, because anytime like I get what I want and then I see greener grass, like I do stop and ask myself, like, wait a minute, is it really greener? But yeah, I was so glad that he invited us on his show.
And sometimes it is greener. I mean, that's the other thing
sometimes.
to think about. Like, so, if you're doing the insurance actuary thing and you've realized, I'm 10 years in, you're too scared to jump down the corporate ladder because you've climbed too high, then, it may be greener if you actually, you've placed your I'm mixing several metaphors here, but you've placed your ladder against the wrong building. It's time you can't just keep climbing up though. You have to slowly climb back down. But I think that's, I think what's true about, the grass is always greener parable is we need to be content with what we currently have if we want to appreciate something better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to touch on the story you talked about that you read. Yeah. Josh Wagner, he's a friend of mine, writer. He's actually a mentor I have a mentoring team. He's one of my team members. He was explaining to me about how when he gets really, really inappropriate thoughts, because we all get inappropriate thoughts at one time or another, and we get to decide whether or not we get to continue those thoughts, or we can kind of try to push them away or compartmentalize them or whatever. But specifically, we were talking about how the conversation got started because we were talking about how I was saying, dude, when I've done mushrooms in the past, like I start to get these narratives going on in my head that really like it kind of, that's what ruins my experience with that psychedelic. And he was explaining to me, dude, when you get those thoughts, he's like, whether you're on shrooms or not, he's like, just start to imagine how that would make a really good plot for a book. And he's like, go ahead and play it out, but with that intention of like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, government's out to get me, and all these other paranoid thoughts. Like, yeah, that would be an interesting book plot, wouldn't it? And then it's like it allows me to just explore ideas that normally I would just kind of cut off. But now I can take like a really crazy wild thought and be like, what if that was a story? How would that story play out?
What benefit do you get from that?
Closure. Like, instead of like thinking about, or I should say not thinking about, like, I'm trying to think of the most, I don't do that often, but I'm trying to think of the most recent thing. Like,
you should read more Chuck Palahniuk.
Yeah.
And that's what he does.
Yeah,
right?
he really does.
He takes those deep, dark, ugly things and creates stories out of them. And I think, what it was so interesting about that conversation is seeing how his psychological health was tied to his writing, because he was able to sort of flush that stuff out of his brain, I think.
Yeah, I can remember the last time it happened to me, watching Game of Thrones and looking at, I forget her name. It's the queen on there that like everyone hates on Game of Thrones.
I've never seen her.
But she's sexy.
She is sexy.
Cersei.
Yeah, she is sexy. But I was watching that show, and after it, I started thinking, I was like, God, like I could not imagine being that evil of a person. Like that would be, and then, I get a random thought of like doing something evil. And then instead of looking at that thought and being like, oh, no, Ryan, you're not evil. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist in your world. It's just fantasy. Like I can look at that and be like, I can look at that thought and I can look in the mirror and be like, okay, Ryan, I'm the devil. What would you do if you were the devil, Ryan? Like it totally helps me to get that, to play it out without actually playing it out.
Do you meditate?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, what you're describing is very much like you have these thoughts that come into your head, and the novice tries to stop them.
Yes.
But what you learn eventually is that by trying to stop them, you energize them.
Right.
And so you just sort of, ignore them, let it go. Like, oh, there's another thought. Okay, let's get back to this. And by not resisting it, you allow them to just fade out rather than energizing them with resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought of it, the corollary there between meditation and playing the story out, but that's very much true. With meditation, the thing that is most difficult is trying to stop the thought. I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying to do good at meditation. I'm a 7 out of 10 meditator today. and like, well, that means you're doing it wrong, right? Yeah. And I think the same thing with maybe the stories. But you're right, the Chuck Palahniuk thing. I think maybe a lot of his sort of psychological health, everyday well-being is tied to his ability to get those stories out of his head. It almost gives him permission to let go via the page.
This makes me think about, I was talking about that episode on Philosophy Bites about how Buddhism is the right religion, but it's basically about this guy he's a Buddhist, and he basically puts out his argument on why he thinks it's the right religion. But the one thing that really stood out to me was about how we have these thoughts enter our mind, and we associate those thoughts with who we are as a person. And he basically explains how, and I'm going to do a bad job of paraphrasing this, but he explains how we might get a random thought. Like I might get a thought of, oh, I want to rob a bank. And I would never actually act on robbing a bank. And that's easy for me to look at that thought and say, oh, I would never do that. But sometimes we get thoughts that we are maybe embarrassed about or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And we start to associate that with, oh man, that's who we are. And we got to watch out for that. Where through meditation and through the practice of Buddhism, he was talking about how you can kind of look at these thoughts and you can kind of let them flow through you, and you get to decide which thoughts you grab onto and what you act on, and what you kind of let go and accept that, yeah, there are these random thoughts that enter our brain. That doesn't necessarily mean it's us. Yeah. All right.
I think
we are like totally going off topic now.
We've derailed and several tangents, so to speak. We did the Kevin Rose show this weekend.
Oh yeah, that was great.
We went up to Portland for that, and man, it was a great conversation we had with him. He invited us over to his house, and I have this picture of him showing us how big his microphone is. It's his wife's microphone. It looks like we're comparing sex toys. He's like showing you that he has this biggest smile on his face, and you're looking at it like if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see my expression there. One last thing before we talk about YouTube. Gym City Market. So Ryan and I are from Dayton, Ohio. One of the largest food deserts in the country is in Dayton, Ohio. West side of Dayton doesn't have a single grocery store in the entire city. And so they have access to food like Cheetos and liquor at the liquor store, but not nutrition. And so we're trying to help them build a nonprofit co-op, grocery co-op there on the west side of Dayton. And we've raised just over $40,000 so far, about $45,000, $25,000 from us, and also our publishing company, Asymmetrical Press, was able to donate about $1,400 from Asymmetrical, and our audience has raised the rest. We're trying to get to $100,000. So if you all want to contribute to that and provide food, not just food, but education, because I think that's one of the bigger hurdles as well. Just because you have access to food doesn't mean you have that you're going to pick the carrots and the kale over the Twinkies and the Cheetos. Mm-hmm. And so providing education as well. The last grocery store closed there over a decade ago. Yeah, and we're trying to fix that. So if you're interested in helping out with that, just go to theminimalists.com/Dayton, and you can contribute whatever you want. Even if it's just a few bucks, it'll help out a lot. If you want to comment on this episode, you can do so on YouTube, just youtube.com/theminimalists. Also on YouTube, we're posting about one new video every day now, including some living room conversations, quickie podcast episodes, Our new vlog series, we just put out the first episode. It's called A Meaningful Life. Basically just a little synopsis of what happened over the course of a month, things that we find meaningful. We've got some minimalist home tours and some video essays coming soon. And if you want all of our podcast show notes in your inbox, you could sign up for our email list over at theminimalists.com. Ryan, you got anything else for us?
Here are some voicemail comments and tips from our listeners.
Hi guys, I'm Brittany, originally from Montana, now living in New York. I wanted to call because you guys speak a lot about intention. While I believe that intention is important when buying, I also think we should use intention when we're decluttering. For example, I'm a huge movie fan and recently got rid of over 60 DVDs. Instead of dropping them off at the thrift store to be sold, I donated them all to my local library. Like so, my boyfriend was finally ready to give up his Xbox, so we found a local shelter that frequently has children, and we donated the games and consoles to them. While it does create a few extra trips, your things can really create value for someone else if you let them.
Hi, Josh and Ryan. I'm Soraya from Brooklyn. I just finished listening to your Patreon podcast, Indebted, and it came to my mind a couple of months ago. I finished reading the book from Rachel Cruz and her dad, Smart Money, Smart Kids, or something like that. And they talk a lot about chores, giving their kids chores and paying them for those chores. So I have 3 kids, and they each one have chores to do, make their beds. My older daughter do my younger daughter the hair every morning. My older daughter vacuum. Of course, there's a lot of chores that they know they just have to do without getting paid, just because they are part of the family and it's their house too, and everybody has to help. But paying them for chores teach them the relation between work and money, and how anything in life is free. You have to earn it. So I recommend that book to every parent, every grandparent. It's really amazing, and they talk a lot about how they did it when they were growing up, and what that family came from bankruptcy to what they are right now. It's really, really, really good.
Hi guys, this is Molly in Detroit. I am calling in response to a knitter's question about her yarn collection. Among knitting, crocheting, etc. circles, this collection of supplies is often called stash. You guys are right in saying that this type of collection is primarily just for when items, so it's certainly better than just in case items, but the collection of these just for when items can also become out of control. There's a term crafters use called sable, which means stash accumulation beyond life expectancy. And that is something it is best not to achieve or even approach. First thing to do is probably to establish a maximum size for your stash and where you will contain it, and then think about what your ideal would be. There are some things you may want to minimize because you find your taste has changed since you bought them, or if you're honest with yourself, they were really just in case purchases, or just, ooh, this is a pretty shiny thing and I want it purchases. There are other things that you're going to want to keep, and you need to focus on actually using them and making that when become now. For my part, I've been knitting down my stash since before I discovered the Minimalist. It's at a size now that I feel fairly comfortable with, but ideally I would get to a point where I only have the project I'm working on, or maybe one complicated project and one simple project, and then the yarn for the next project I want to start. That way I'll be able to make things when I'm still excited about the project, because I'm real excited when I buy the yarn, and then years later I'm not so excited. But be able to make it while I'm still excited, and then also maintain the ability to start something new even when I can't get to the store. Somebody else's ideal stash might be bigger than that, but for anyone who retains that creative supplies just for when, not just knitters, but anyone, I urge you to think about just how far off that when probably is, and set a limit for yourself.
All right, y'all, that's almost it for this episode. If you have a question for the Minimalist, give us a call, 406-219-7839. You can also email a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com. We're especially looking for questions about discipline, spouses, and preferences or personalities. And I just want to say thanks to Chris for being here,
You're
man.
awesome, man.
Appreciate
Thank you so much.
Appreciate what you're doing. Folks can find you on Twitter at @ThatChrisRyan. Tangentially Speaking is the podcast. Your website, tangentiallyspeaking.com or chrisryanphd.com.
That's it.
All right.
Yeah.
Sex at Dawn.
Oh, also, yeah, check out the book Sex at Dawn, and we are proud supporters of his podcast on Patreon.
Oh,
so
thank you,
Absolutely.
guys.
Yeah, man.
yeah,
I hope it's a minimal contribution.
You know that $1 million a month you're getting?
Oh, that's for you guys. Thanks so much.
Chris, thank you so much for being here. I really
Hey,
appreciate it.
Yeah,
My
man.
pleasure.
You're
Thank
awesome.
you.
All right, y'all. If y'all leave here today with just one message, we hope it's this: love people and use things, because the opposite never works. Thanks for listening, y'all.
We'll see you next time. Bye.
The Minimalists.